I am Frank Schumpert, your host, and you are listening to the Empires of History podcast, the Ottoman series, episode 11, of Thy Insolence and Folly, a prelude to the Battle of Ankara. Please stay tuned to the end of the show for news, other podcast recommendations, and how you can support the show. After the defeat of the Crusade of Nicopolis covered in episode 10, parts 1 and 2, Bayezid was at the top of his game. The decade-long reign of the Thunderbolt saw nothing but a string of amazing victories, punctuated from time to time by a few setbacks that were easily overcome. The years of careful planning by the opportunistic Orhan, the deep maneuverings of Murad, were like the fluid motions of an archer drawing back his bow and releasing an arrow aimed at the heart of the world. Bayezid surely, everyone must have thought, was that arrow. Reckless he was, yes, but also daring. He oftentimes displayed a complete disregard for political sensibilities, yes, but who cared about optics when the iron might of the Janissaries read your back? Therefore, looking around him in 1397, the world seemed ready to break under Bayezid's boot. In the north, the Hungarians were licking their wounds and pulling away from the empire's borders. Wallachia was paying tribute, Moldova was cowering in a corner, and to the immediate west, Moravian Serbia, that part of the country controlled by Stephen the Tall, son of the executed Lazar, was a dependable ally. Western Europe as a whole was dealt a terrible psychological blow by the defeat of the Crusaders at Nicopolis and totally ignored Byzantium's cries for aid. Assessing a map of the region during this time period, the Ottoman Empire looked to have fully rounded out its Balkan holdings. In Anatolia, only the stubborn Karamanid Beylik remained to be dealt with in a few city-states in the far eastern portion of the region. The Sultan, in the presence of Hungarian envoys, was said to have grabbed one of the battle axes of the Janissaries and proclaimed, "In Konya is there to be found a righteous man? What man loves his lord might rid me of the meddlesome prince?" The meddlesome prince he was referring to was Alauddin Bey of Karmana, and centered in the city of Konya. A few weeks later, word reached the Sultan that Alauddin had been poisoned, and the city stood ready to receive their rightful lord and sultan. In late 1398, Bayezid set off for Konya to claim, after nearly a century of defying Ottoman ambitions in Anatolia, the city for the empire. The Thunderbolt moved with all haste, as had long since established his reputation. Arriving in the city, the Sultan ordered the execution of Alauddin's assassins, stating that he had acted in passion and haste of the moment, and hadn't meant any harm to befall the great Bey. In actuality, Bayezid had more likely seen it prudent that it was best not to set a pattern of effecting political change by open assassination. It set a bad precedent, and he couldn't be seen to gain too much by such a cowardly act. The Ottoman Empire, after the annexation of Konya, now had expanded to contain nearly all of central Anatolia, and probed into territory further east. As I said in previous episodes, especially in episode 8, The Thunderbolt Strikes, Bayezid's conquests in Anatolia were mostly skin-deep. The people not only resented the often brutal and violent takeover of their cities and towns and lands, but also the fact that home rule, a staple of the previous Ottoman sultans, had been stripped away. In place of the thoughtful policy of leaving the ruling class mostly intact, Sultan Bayezid placed equally brutal and violent governors in his wake, with no connection to local peoples or traditions. The world of Anatolia, also known as Asia Minor, in the 13th century, was a wild and untamed land, populated by a people accustomed to hardship, but also fiercely independent and deeply resentful of outside control over their affairs. Rebellions became frequent, and the Sultan spent the better part of the remainder of 1398 riding to and fro, putting down this or that outbreak. Watching all of this unfold from afar was a man historians today say was responsible for over 17 million deaths. Before there was Hitler and after there was history's greatest mass murderer, Genghis Khan, there is he who we in the West best know as Timur, also Timur-Lenk. From the multitude of nomadic peoples, there arose the Tartar tribes, yet another group roaming the great Eurasian steppe from China. They rode into battle on swift horses with the bow, and first came across iron way back in the 1200s, it is thought. When even the strongest of men couldn't bend the material, they assumed magic was involved. A magic so great nothing on earth could bend it to its will, save the fires from which it came. As such, a tradition grew amongst the Tartar tribes of bestowing the name Timur upon great leaders of men. Thus the meaning behind Timur. The second part so often attached to his name, Lang, Lane, or more accurately lame, comes from a limp the warlord walked with. Some accounts give it was a childhood sickness, others a wound sustained in combat. We may never know. Gur-e-Amir, later Timur, was born on April of 1336, though the date of his birth is up for some dispute, in an area close to the Caspian Sea in Central Asia. Timur grew up, and as a young man in his 20s, unified the Turkish and Mongolian clans, and wielded them into one of the most effective and feared war machines in history. Together, Timur and his warriors would hack, impale, decapitate, and torture all those around them until finally carving out the Timuridic Empire. From the fires of the unspeakable suffering Timur inflicted would emerge a kind of primordial terror forged into an instrument of oppression. Seeing himself as God's shadow on earth, Timur proclaimed early that, as just there is but one God in all of the earth, there should be but one ruler. The last time the Middle East had been acquainted with such a ruthless warlord was the sack of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258. In the 1370s, Timur exploded out of Central Asia to build his empire. Taking the side of Shi'is, known during their time as Twelvers, when warring against Sunni, and proclaiming Sunni when warring against Shi'i, Timur seemed to enjoy making a mockery of politics and smash everybody before him. All cities which resisted him were completely destroyed, every building razed to the ground, and salt spread to despoil agricultural lands. Women, children, and men were all murdered in the most gruesome of manners. It is not known exactly when Timur systematically implemented the practice of pyramid heads, so emblematic of his conquest, but it has become a defining feature of his reign. The severed heads of his victims, those who resisted, both Christian and Muslim, young and old, were decapitated in mass executions, and their heads stacked neatly into pyramids over 100 feet tall. A massive superpower of its day, the Timuridic Empire encompassed all of Central Asia, parts of China, a quarter of India, all of Persia, and the area around Baghdad. By 1399, Timur's forces had reached the outskirts of the Ottoman Empire. All the other Islamic powers of the world, save the Mamelukes based out of Egypt, had been defeated, beaten, enslaved, and then absorbed into Timur's empire. Aware of the Sultan Bayezid's reputation as a leader and military strategist, Timur had at first sought more or less peaceful coexistence with his fellow Muslim ruler. For one, Timur needed time to focus on his main foe, that of the Mamluks, who had stubbornly refused to acknowledge him as their superior despite their slave status. Second, Timur was well aware of the Turks' fighting abilities, as he had several Turkish tribes in his employ. With the Ottoman Empire mostly confined to the western portion of Anatolia, so long as they kept their focus in the Christian Balkans, Timur was content to leave them be. But Timur was also faced with two problems right from the get-go by 1398. The defeat of the Crusaders at Nicopolis in 1396 meant that Bayezid no longer had any great foe in Christian Europe to tie up his forces, leaving him free to roam. When Bayezid turned to Anatolia, he created numerous disenfranchised Turkish beys who fled to Timur's court, seeking refuge and vengeance. These expats, though, were easily ignored. But what could not be ignored was when Konya fell in 1398, and the Sultan had pushed the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire all the way past Central Asia Minor. Now the headquarters, lines of supply and communication, and assembly areas for Timur's campaigns against the Mamelukes were threatened. Yet, Timur hoped war, at least temporarily after he had secured his southern flank against the Mamluks, could be put off and a direct confrontation with the Ottoman Empire avoided. Timur seemed to see Bayezid's strategic interest as strictly in central Anatolia and Europe, and the warlord had visions of invading China. If only Bayezid had the same strategic foresight. His spies, scouts, and Akinci raiders all carried back news that Baghdad had fallen, and Timur was over the horizon in the eastern part of Asia Minor. The Ottoman Council of Government advised extreme caution. Bayezid, however, seemed irrationally bent on offending and pointlessly provoking the Central Asian warlord wherever he possibly could, and in the most insulting manner possible. Throughout most of history, we hear of the military campaigns, official government edicts, and matters such as geography, resources, and other strategic concerns. Lost in the hum of our analysis, however, is the very real human factors that are alive in the movement of nations. Pride, ego, fear, lust, greed, reputation, good old-fashioned jealousy, are all variables that have more often than not, and just as powerfully, launched wars, enacted changes, and carried movements throughout entire epochs of history. The story of the growing rivalry between Timur and Bayezid is one such snapshot in history. From a strictly realist assessment of the political, military, economic, and strategic reality on the ground, there was no real reason the two powers had to go to war. Had there been another sultan, a Murad or Orhan, it'd be a pretty safe bet to place on there never having been a conflict. But sometimes history likes to play tricks on us and put people in charge who do things and don't act the way they're supposed to act. At first, Timur was respectful and treated Bayezid as an equal. Yet as the Sultan's domains came closer, he grew increasingly frustrated. His anger was finally roused when in 1401 the Sultan forces occupied the city of Sivas in the far eastern portion of Anatolia that bordered Timur's lands. The Bey of Siva had long been a vassal of the Asian warlord, and in their diplomatic correspondence we can see the final breakdown between Ottoman and Timuridic relations. Keep in mind that diplomatic correspondence of this type was often a very public affair, contrasted with today's dealings that happen mainly behind closed doors. A courier from the court of the sovereign would arrive in his counterpart's assemblage, then to read the message of his lord out loud for everyone present to hear. Any hint of insult could have dire consequences, and the status and reputation of the addresser to the addressee would be carefully laid out in proper format. Timur's response to the Ottoman occupation of Siva was a terse letter sent to Bayezid straight from the Asian warlord, and namesake of this episode's title. What is the foundation of thy insolence and folly? Timur then goes on to mock Bayezid's recent conquest. Thou hast fought some battles in the woods of Anatolia, contemptible trophies. At the end of the letter, Timur still sought a way to avoid all-out war. Be wise in time, reflect and repent, and avert the thunder of our vengeance, which is yet suspended over thy head. A smart move, no doubt, on the part of Bayezid would have been to pull out of Sivas and attempt a rapprochement with Timur. But could the Thunderbolt Sultan, now entrapped by his own reputation and ego, have sat back and bowed to Timur in the presence of his own court? The Sultan responded to Timur, "Thy armies are innumerable, be they so. But what are the arrows of the flying Tartar against the scimitars and battle axes of my firm and invincible Janissaries?" Timur, while preparing his armies to invade Mameluke-controlled Syria, shot back, "Thou art no more than an ant. Why wilt thou seek to provoke the elephants? Alas, they will trample thee under feet." The last exchange between the two sovereigns came in the middle of 1401. Bayezid, receiving reports of Timur's army marching through Syria, goaded Timur, "If I flee the battlefield a coward, may my wives be 3 times divorced from my bed. But if thou hast not courage to meet me in the field, mayest thou again receive thy wives after they have thrice endured the embraces of a stranger." The personal insult was too much. After this, especially since Bayezid had the message sent with both of the sovereign signatures at the bottom. The Sultan's own signature was emblazoned in gold, and Timur's in small black letters at the very end of the document. Upon receiving the letter from Bayezid, Timur is said to have flew into a rage. The warlord stayed up the entire night, studying maps, quizzing his logistical officers, and making ready to muster his unstoppable army. 4 days later, Timur's army marched from their headquarters on the west bank of the upper Euphrates River and arrived outside the gates of Sivas. The Sivas garrison was commanded by a small force of Ottomans, and the main defenders were Armenian Christians. Their leader, Sultan Bayezid's son Suleiman, sent urgent letters to his father, who was in Edirne at the time. After receiving no news from his father and the city surrounded, Suleiman slipped out with his bodyguard, intent on returning with a relief force. Timur, realizing reinforcements might be headed his way, doubled down on the siege, and the city fell after 18 days. The inhabitants of Sivas could expect no mercy, as Timur was no fan of Christians. He had the Armenian men, women, and children marched out in front of the city and executed by decapitation. Their heads, all 35,000 of them, were stacked into 14 pyramids. After having inflicted this defeat upon the Ottomans, Timur didn't press his luck, despite thousands of Anatolian horsemen flocking to his banner. Instead, he decided to turn south against the Mamelukes and resume his campaign there. Meanwhile, in Edirne, the Sultan received dispatches from the east as the situation unfolded. After having thus provoked Timur in the manner he did, you'd think Bayezid would head up to Sivas as fast as he possibly could. Even pulling off one of his thunderbolt marches, he was so famous for, and striking the city unexpectedly from the north, or exploiting the setback and bypassing Sivas while Timur was tied up besieging it and wiping out its headquarters. Either move would have swung the initiative in favor of the Ottomans, or at the very least provided them the opportunity to establish forward defensive positions. Instead, Bayezid stayed put, neither giving out orders to muster the army, nor calling a council of war to decide the next step. Some historians have speculated that the fall of Sivas in 1401 had been an unexpected blow to the Sultan, who didn't seem to know how to react. However, cities, towns, and fortresses changed hands frequently in the Balkans, and so I'm not sure how much water this explanation holds. Yet another theory put forth is that Bayezid had spent most of his time in the harem and lost himself in the oblivion of soft pleasures, thereby dulling his faculties and stilling his desires for war. This, I too feel, is wrought with difficulties. For one, even though campaigning had slowed down from about 1398 to 1400, the Sultan was never in one place for very long, and frequently led his forces on large-scale raids. Although incompetent sultans, made ineffectual by the pleasures of the harem and machinations of favorites, will be a very real thing in the next 200 years, I don't believe at this time it was much of a major factor. Whatever the reason, Bayezid didn't move out when he should have. It seemed as though it may suddenly have dawned upon the Sultan, sometime after his son Suleiman came begging for aid, that he was dealing with someone very different than Christian lords. In the person of Timur, Bayezid seemed to have finally realized he was confronted by someone with an army as powerful as his, just as intelligent, and more than able to match him in energy. Truly tested by a foe greater than himself now, Bayezid lingered and fretted while the strategic initiative slipped away. In next week's episode, we will watch as Bayezid's haughty boast withered into pathetic silence as he marshaled his army against a foe better than himself. The Battle of Ankara will be told in detail in its terrible aftermath. For those of you looking to fill the time until next week's episode, please go and check out Flashpoint History. Think this might be something you're interested in? Just let me read you the interview I left on iTunes. Wonderful podcast. When it comes to history podcasts, I look for strong narrative voice, solid structure, and tight research. I listened up to episode 9, The History of the Reconquista, and appreciate how Nitin handles this often fraught period of history, with grace and historical analogies. Listen now, you won't be disappointed. And by the way, are you a writer, author? Do you need help editing your manuscript, paper, query letter, and the like? Oh, what's that you say? You don't need any help? Before you decide, I suggest you let my good friend Mark Schultz take a look first. He is a freelance editor with over 40 years of experience. You can find him at wordrefiner.com, and that is spelled wordrefiner.com. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider supporting the show by going to Apple Podcast, Stitcher, and Spotify, and by visiting the show's website at, all one word, Empiresofhistorypodcast.blueberry.net, where you can comment and subscribe. Do you feel like supporting the show? You can stop in at Patreon under the show's page and make a donation. Any little bit would help. All proceeds from Patreon are poured straight back into the show in the form of purchase of books, scholarly articles, and other such on the subject matter. As usual, if you feel I can improve the show, please drop me a line. Empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. I love it so much when I get listeners' email. It really makes me think that what I'm doing is worth it. Many, many thanks.